All right, welcome again. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project. It's the series that runs January through March every year. Our presentation today is Daughters of Freedom, the Rise of the Women's Rights Movement, and it's being brought to us by Ranger David from the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a partnership between Internet2, the National Park Service, and the National Archives. This is just a quick reminder, by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded, streamed, and archived as part of our program. So we do save recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube site so that students and teachers can access them if they weren't able to join live. We're really excited to have everyone here. We have lots of people today. I think we have individual students from a whole classroom here, which is really exciting. So there'll be lots of opportunities to participate. I just want to go over some expectations and some opportunities to participate today. So when you registered, if you indicated you wanted to be on video, I have promoted you. If you think that you did include that in your registration and I haven't promoted you, go ahead and put that in the chat. You'll also be able to talk and answer over audio if you want, even if you're not using video. So when we ask a question, if you want to answer the question, you can use the raise hand icon. And from there, I'll call on you and unmute you so that you can answer or ask your question. And then, of course, we have the chat box. You should be able to use the chat box to ask or answer questions to the presenter. So you won't be able to chat with your other friends here in the Zoom session, but you can ask questions to us and answer questions as a presenter. We can see what you're saying. Whoops. Sorry about that. All that said, please just make sure that you're respectful of those tools. So we want you to participate as much as possible, but just make sure we're staying on topic in the chat box, making sure our questions and answers are directly related to what's happening. And then this is just another thanks for joining us today. This is our website if you want to see more of our future programs. We hope you'll join us again. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and hand it over to David, to our presenter.
All right, well, thank you so much, and thank you for everybody who's here today. Yeah, my name is David Newman. I'm a park ranger here with the National Park Service at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. And now that I have that introduction out of the way, I want to go ahead and share my screen as well. And hopefully you all be able to see the presentation here shortly. Swap these views. So you all should just be seeing my slide on the screen there. Is that right?
Yep, we can see it.
Awesome. So yeah, so today we're going to be doing a program called Daughters of Freedom, Rise of the Women's Rights Movement. And we know that the women's rights movement in the United States really picked up in the mid to late 19th century. So that's kind of the era that we're going to be looking at, the mid to late 1800s. And of course, I come from Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Ulysses S. Grant was a man who lived during this time period in the 1800s. He's probably best remembered for his work as a general in the American Civil War, and then of course his time as 18th President of the United States. Grant was, according to him, a president committed to civil rights. And so we're going to be kind of looking at how Grant was involved or what he might have done with the women's rights movement during his presidency as well. Before we move on, I just want to point out where I'm coming to you from today. I'm coming to you live from Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in St. Louis, Missouri. We maintain the home that President Grant lived in before the Civil War. So the greenhouse that you see in the center of your screen there, to the right of my picture, that is a home called Whitehaven. And this is the place where Grant lived with his family for over half a decade, just before the Civil War began. So this is the house that we preserve here at Whitehaven. And during today's presentation, we're not only going to be learning about Grant and the women's rights movement history, but we're going to be looking at several documents that might help assist us with that learning process. These documents are known as primary sources, and a primary source is pretty much any any document from the past that was produced in the past that we can learn something from today. So that could be speeches, newspaper articles, drawings or photographs taken at the time. And primary sources are kind of like clues. And if you want to think of historians as detectives, I think that's a good thing to do, because as historians, one thing we do is we collect as many clues or primary sources as we can, and we use those documents to tell a bigger story about history. That's how we really learn about history. And if you've read something in a textbook, just know that the people who wrote that textbook, they got all that information from looking at primary sources. So today we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of primary sources, from documents to photos and drawings, and hopefully we can all learn a little bit together about the women's rights movement of the 19th century. So before we really dive into today's lesson, I just want to throw a question out to you all, and feel free to put this in the chat if you want, or if you want to unmute or raise your hand, we can unmute you, and you can certainly talk to us in person. But I want to put this question out to you guys. Think of a time in your life when you were treated unfairly. How did that make you feel? So first think of a time when you were treated unfairly, and then think about the feeling or the reaction that you had to that experience. And it looks like we have a hand raised.
Sure, Crystal, you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Well, when I was treated unfairly, it just makes me mad, and it makes me sad because it's really unfair. I just feel like it's not fair for people to be treated unfairly for the color of their skin or their gender, because everybody needs to be treated equally.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Absolutely. Great. Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in?
It looks like we have Galileo saying it makes them angry and mad. It looks like Carlos has their hand raised. Carlos, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. Oh, Carlos, it won't let me unmute you because of your Zoom. You're using an older version of Zoom. But Farmington Falls put in the chat, disappointed that someone is acting that way. It looks like Gabe has a hand raised. Gabe, I'm going to let you talk. Go ahead, Gabe.
One time I was at a store and my mom went to go put something back, and an adult, they came and just went in front of me. They just shortcutted me.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So how did that make you feel when that happened?
Not very great.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we're treated unfairly, I think a common reaction to that is feeling mad or sad or upset, and kind of rightfully so, right? If somebody does something that we think is wrong or we think is unfair, that's often a reaction that we as humans experience. The reason I ask this question is because women in the 19th century were often treated unfairly. So I want to kind of take a moment to look at some of the different ways that women during Grant's lifetime were not treated as equals, or were treated unfairly just because they were women. So let's look at this next slide here. And in this slide, we're going to see a photo of a family during the Civil War. And we can kind of see mom, dad, and their kids. And one of the first things you may notice is that the dad here is a soldier, so we can kind of see, what his job is, and it looks like he's carrying a saw. But the woman here is carrying a basket of laundry, and her stance and the look on her face might kind of tell you a lot about what she thinks about her role doing that laundry. Maybe to me, she looks kind of sad or upset, or maybe just kind of worn out because she's sick of doing that. And I should point out that, you know, in the 19th century, many women didn't have paid jobs. Many of them had large families to take care of, and without modern appliances and conveniences, they spent so much of their life with kind of household drudgery, just doing laundry, you know, making food, cleaning the house, and because of this, they didn't really have opportunities to go out and do some things that they might want to do otherwise. Many women growing up had some access to education early on, but usually after elementary school, they no longer were able or were sent to school. And so there was kind of a lack of access to education for a lot of women during that time. And those who did end up in the workplace with paying jobs often got less pay or had lower paying jobs than their male counterparts. And so what we're kind of starting to see, I guess, is a pattern in the 19th century for women is a lack of access to personal time, personal money that they could spend, education, and of course, they also didn't have the right to vote. And of course, without the right to vote, that's kind of a lack of voice in society as a whole. And I want to add that as bad as women as a general group had it, African-American women in particular and other minority groups in the 19th century, those women experienced even more discrimination based on their race. And so women as a whole had it bad, but minority women and African-American women in particular here in the United States often faced further discrimination because not only were they a woman, but because of their race. So I want to talk about kind of the beginnings of the women's rights movement, right? We know that people, you know, when they're not treated fairly, get mad or sad or upset, sometimes even angry about that. And we know that two women in particular kind of kickstarted what we think of as the 19th century women's rights movement. It was actually, I should mention, born out of the abolitionist movement. Abolitionists were people in the 19th century who were trying to end slavery in the United States. Ulysses S. Grant's parents, for instance, were abolitionists. They were actively writing and campaigning for the end of slavery in the United States. And a lot of women kind of got on board with this idea of ending slavery. Grant's own mother was very much involved in that movement. However, women weren't always accepted by the men in the abolitionist movement. Case in point, these two women that you see on this slide here, they went to a convention for the abolitionist movement. They called it the 1840 Anti-Slavery Convention. And if you look at the picture here, you can see that this is largely a group of white men sitting up front. These two women are nowhere to be seen in this picture. And that's because they were actually forced to sit here in the back. So this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. They actually met at this convention, and basically what happened is when they arrived at this convention, they, among other women who were there, decided that they wanted to give some speeches and kind of voice their own opinions about the abolition of slavery. And we know that when they said this, when they spoke up and said, we want to voice our opinions, that the men who are organizing the convention said, no way, you're not going to have a chance to speak. This is a convention for men. You're allowed to attend, but you're going to have to sit far away from the stage. And if you look in this picture, I've actually drawn a rectangle around the section that these women were actually forced to sit in. And you can imagine, without modern amplification, no big screens or anything like that, sitting that far away from the stage basically meant that you were not being included in that discussion, nor were your voices heard in things like speeches. As you can imagine, when they were being treated unfairly, these two women were pretty mad, and they decided that in addition to being abolitionists, they were also going to start a new movement for women's rights, so that perhaps someday women would be allowed to speak up in conventions like the 1840 Slavery Convention. So these two women definitely start to spearhead that conversation and that movement in the United States. Fast forward 8 years, in 1848, they organized the first women's rights conventions at Seneca Falls, New York. It was held in the Wesleyan Chapel, which is that building that you see at the lower right corner there. And these women banded together to fight for women's rights, including, well, I'll just read the description here. The convention advertised itself as the discussion of social, civil, and religious conditions and the rights of women. But specifically, they were looking at one right. When we look at this picture here on the screen, we can see all these women kind of around a stage. And here's this one woman here speaking on the stage, but right next to her are two signs. And it says, join the National Women's Suffrage Association. Does anybody know what suffrage means? What they might have been kind of discussing at this convention? What does suffrage mean? I see we got a couple of hands raised. And maybe somebody in the chat there too.
Galileo says right to vote.
Yeah, the right to vote, right? So when these women banded together for the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, what they're really looking at is the right to vote. And of course, this was probably the most important aspect of the women's rights movement, because once they had the right to vote, they could go about making change by electing people who represented them in government. And so the right to vote really becomes the central issue of the women's rights movement, and definitely the biggest issue at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. So the end result of this convention was a lot of discussion about how to go about making this change. And they all decided collectively that they needed to produce a document, something that would go into print to tell the rest of the country what was discussed at this convention and what their demands were, right? They're going to make a set of demands. A woman named Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we'll see on this next slide, wrote the document of demands. And they call this document the Declaration of Sentiments. And up there in the top left corner, you can kind of see what the original document looked like right here when it went into print. And there's Elizabeth Cady Stanton there on the left side as well. And I just want to read you guys part of this document, what they call the preamble, or the very first paragraph of the document. And then we'll be kind of talking about it some more. But it starts, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that which they have hitherto occupied, but one to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to such a course. So that's pretty flowery language. Maybe it's kind of hard to take all that in, but let's look at this next section, and this part might be a little more familiar to you. It says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Had to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So now I want to take a moment to take a poll. Does this sound familiar to anybody? This language? So we're going to go ahead and pull up a poll up on the screen here. And I want you guys just to kind of chime in and let me know what document that you think that this language was kind of borrowed from. So we're going to be looking at three choices: the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Gettysburg Address, or the Star-Spangled Banner. So go ahead, put your answers in the poll. Let me know what you think, what document you think they borrowed this language from. And while you're putting your votes in, you might start thinking about why they chose this document as the one that they borrowed this language from. Why in particular was this document kind of chosen for their cause? It looks like we got over 50%, 60% of the votes coming in. Okay. And while those roll in, I'll point out some of the things that I have sitting around me. This is actually an example. If you guys can see this right here, this is an example of a 19th century ballot box. So you can see that it was clear in those days when people put their votes in the box. The election officials and anybody standing in the room actually knew who they voted for. So women were fighting for the rights to exercise the ballot. And they would have been putting those things into ballot boxes like this. The other thing you'll see sitting on my table are these yellow sashes. Yellow and purple, or gold and purple, kind of became the colors of the women's rights movement. And of course, many banners like the one here behind me were made. This particular banner says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" So it looks like we've got 70% of the votes coming in, 74%. And I'll give you guys just a few more seconds to kind of finish up with that. When you look at this this document here, this first part of the document, you also might think about like what lines were actually borrowed from the original. Okay, so it looks like voting has slowed down. So if we want to go ahead and, I don't know if we close the poll or how that works. Okay, yeah, great. So it looks like 71% of you said the Declaration of Independence. You are correct. They use the Declaration of Independence as the model for the Declaration of Sentiments. Even the name of their document kind of sounds like the Declaration of Independence. So what lines, I just kind of want to hear from you guys, what lines in that document sound the most like the Declaration of Independence? And go ahead and raise your hand if you want to unmute, or you can share in the chat.
All right, it looks like Crystal has her hand raised. So Crystal, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Crystal.
So the model of the Declaration is independence. I didn't really understand, but I get it because it kind of sounds the same.
It sounds really similar. So Crystal, what parts of that document, the Declaration of Sentiments, what part of that sounds the most like the Declaration to you?
Well, I've never really seen it, but the way it's designed is kind of the same way as the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, good. Does anybody have any specific lines in here that kind of ring a bell? Looks like hand raised at Farmington Falls.
Yeah, go ahead, Farmington Falls.
Definitely the first few lines.
Yeah.
The only like difference made in the first few lines is how it's men and women instead of just men.
Exactly. So yeah, so they pretty much borrowed, especially in the second paragraph here, they really borrowed the language from, almost word for word from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, so far it's exactly the same, but you're right. They add, and women are created equal. In my last session, somebody pointed out the other line too, about the pursuit, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are liberty and pursuit of happiness. So this all sounds very familiar when you think about the Declaration of Independence. Why is it then, do you think, that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and other women involved with this project, why do you think they chose the Declaration of Independence as their model? Looks like we've got some hands raised.
Edgewood, did you have an answer you wanted to share? Go ahead, Edgewood.
The Declaration of Independence was very important to history, and everybody knew about it. So
Yeah.
they decided that.
Yeah, well, you're on the right track, right? Everybody already knew about the Declaration of Independence. It's an infamous document. Pretty much everybody living in America, especially 100+ years ago, would have really known that document by heart. So by choosing a familiar document, they're kind of reaching a wider audience, right? If they started from scratch, maybe people wouldn't pay as much attention to it, but by kind of distorting and reusing parts of a very familiar document, they are reaching an audience audience that's already really familiar with that. And what do you think about the idea, you know, that the Declaration of Independence was about independence from the British, right? What do you think these women are seeking independence from? We kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, right? Some of the things that, you know, really made them second-class citizens: the lack of access to education, the lack of voice in politics. And, you know, when it came to independence, women really just wanted some independence from men. Men had all kinds of freedoms and authorities that women didn't have at that time. And they really just kind of wanted some sense of independence and their own voice separate from men. And so, yeah, so when we look at the Declaration of Sentiments, it's pretty clear that they've purposely borrowed a lot of that language to kind of symbolize their purpose. Next, I want to look at kind of the expansion of the movement. So, oh, and first I should also mention that when they produced this document, lots of different people signed it. Ultimately, it was signed by 68 women. You see some of those women in this kind of phony Zoom call set up by Women's Rights National Historic Park. This is something they posted on their Facebook a few weeks ago. You can see a lot of the people on the screen here that were involved in that movement, including Frederick Douglass up here in the upper right corner. He says, "You know who I am." Frederick Douglass was actually one of 38 men that also signed this document. And although a minority within the United States, there were many men who were involved in the women's rights movement and also pushing for the right to vote for American women. And Frederick Douglass was probably the most prominent of those men. I'll just quote from Frederick Douglass here what he says. He gave a speech at a women's rights convention in which he said, "At any rate, seeing that the male government of the world have failed, it can do no harm to try the experiment of a government by man and women united. I have never yet been able to find one consideration, one argument, or suggestion in favor of man's right to participate in civil government which it did not equally apply to the right of women." And Frederick Douglass, he's not only one of the most well-known orators and supporters of women's rights in the 19th century. He's also famous as an abolitionist figure. Frederick Douglass, as you may know, was a former enslaved man. He was enslaved in the American South. And when he was a young man, he actually emancipated himself with his feet, which means he ran away from slavery to the North where he could be free. And Frederick Douglass not only went on to fight for the freedom of all African Americans enslaved in the South, but he also became a big proponent of women's freedom in the 19th century as well. And so he becomes a big advocate in the women's rights movement. And he's also one of those national figures that kind of helps bring this conversation to the national stage. And that's what I want to talk about next, is kind of growing this movement. So we know that people like Douglass were giving speeches around the country in favor of women's rights. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they were going on to different places to kind of help spread their message through speeches and talks and other conventions. But it was really through the passage of literature. Newspapers were written that were specifically about women's rights, and those were spread all over the country. Flyers like the one you see on your screen, it says American Women's Suffrage Association, 17th annual meeting. These meetings start to spring up, and these flyers help spread the message of women's rights. And we know that the first women's rights convention was held in 48, but it was quickly followed by a series of women's rights conventions throughout the 1850s. And in fact, only 2 years later, the first official women's rights convention after Seneca Falls had over 1,000 people participating. And remember, this is when people had to hike overland or ride a horse to get somewhere. There was no flying around the country to get to a central location. So it's pretty impressive that 1,000 people even showed up. That's how much women cared about this in the 19th century. And for the next decade, conventions would be held every year except 1857 until 1860. During one of these conventions in 1851, Elizabeth Cady Stanton meets a woman named Susan B. Anthony. Some of you may have heard of Susan B. Anthony already. She kind of becomes a big figurehead in the women's rights movement, and they become good friends. And Susan B. Anthony actually goes on to start the American Women's Suffrage Association herself. So Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton, they become very close. They become lifelong friends. And we're going to look here at a picture of them actually later in life. So this is a picture on the left-hand side of Elizabeth Cady Stanton seated with Susan B. Anthony standing next to her, and they're looking at a letter that they had written or were writing to the Senate. And you can also see these women on the right-hand side. This is a late 19th century photo, but you can see this woman holding a banner that says "Votes for Women," that, you know, just kind of goes to show you that this is a spreading movement at that time. So, okay, so fast forward a decade. So now about 1861, America's in turmoil over a different issue. And of course, that was the issue of slavery. Within a matter of months in 1861, the American Civil War had begun, and the nation split north and south in this bloody war over slavery. And we know that during this war, women certainly had a vital role to play. Some women served in factories making cartridges and equipment for the war effort. That's what we're seeing in this picture in the circle on the left. There we're seeing some women making cartridges, which is kind of the precursor to modern bullets. Women also served as nurses in the Civil War. We can see kind of in the center of the frame there, we see a woman administering medication to a wounded soldier there. And then there were also women who disguised themselves as men and actually enlisted as infantry soldiers. And one of the pictures that we're seeing on the screen is of Lyons Wakeman there in the bottom right. Lyons was actually named Sarah Rosetta Wakeman. That is a woman, and she is one of at least a couple hundred known women who cut their hair short and disguised themselves as men so that they could serve as soldiers in the war and not just nurses or factory workers. And each of these women had their own reason for fighting in the cause. But Sarah Wakeman, AKA Lyons Wakeman there, served through almost the entire conflict. It's also worth mentioning that women served as spies for both the Confederate and the Union armies. One of the most famous spies you see there in the bottom center of your frame was Harriet Tubman. Can anybody tell me, just raise your hand or type into the chat, who Harriet Tubman was, why she's kind of well known today? She's maybe not well known as being a Union spy. What else did she do?
Go ahead, Edgewood.
Yeah, go ahead, Edgewood.
So, Harriet Tubman was an enslaved African American that at one point got hit with a weight in her head, but also was a leader for all enslaved African Americans to escape from slavery.
Absolutely right. So Harriet Tubman, also known as Moses to those who were enslaved, was one of the most prominent figures in the Underground Railroad, which was a system of safe houses for runaway enslaved people. So Harriet Tubman led these enslaved people from one safe house to the next until they eventually reached freedom in the American North and sometimes as far north as Canada. So Harriet Tubman becomes most famous for her work on the Underground Railroad. And during the Civil War, she continues this work of helping enslaved people run away from the South. But while she's in the South, she's also gathering vital information for the Union Army, the Northern Army, about military stuff going on with the Confederacy. And so she's spying on the Confederacy and she's delivering that information to the Union. Why would she do this? Well, the Union Army was, as of 1863, trying to free as many Southern enslaved people as they possibly could. This is, of course, following the Emancipation Proclamation. And there's kind of a promise being made that after the Civil War is over, if the Union Army wins, that they will try to destroy slavery nationwide. And so Harriet Tubman had a motive beyond just helping the Union Army win the war. She was also, in a big picture kind of way, trying to help end slavery as an institution, which is very much in keeping with what she was doing with the Underground Railroad. So it's kind of interesting to look at the different roles that women played in the war effort. And of course, when the Civil War was over, a lot of these women who had served as nurses and factory workers and spies and even soldiers were really being pressured back into the home setting, back into the roles that they had played before the war. As you can imagine, some women weren't too happy about being pressured back into those roles. How do you all think it made those women feel, being forced out of their jobs in factories and work as nurses, and really kind of the sense of freedom? How do you think it made them feel to be kind of forced back to the way things were before the Civil War? Go ahead and raise your hand if you want to unmute, or type in the chat.
Crystal, you have your hand raised. I'm gonna unmute you. Go ahead, Crystal.
So, I think they feel that really mad and sad because what they're doing is unfair and they make women do stuff, but it's not fair that they're being pushed back to do nurse jobs when they don't want to do something. Not all women want to do the same job because some people want to have different opinions, because not everyone is the same. We're not all robots. We're not all perfect. We don't do the same thing, because it's unfair that they're pushing them out of their jobs, firing them just to be a nurse for the Civil War. Because what they need to do is that people need to be hopefully happy, and they can't just be like pushed out of their jobs just because they need to help the army. I know the army helped us fight for America, but what the people did is not nice. They need to make people do the job that they want, not the job that they want, because it's their opinion, not what they want. It's
Perfect.
not.
Thank you, Crystal.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so heard a lot of good things there. So yeah, so a lot of these women, like you say, humans are not robots, right? We aren't designed to do one job and one job only as a people. Everybody has their own interests and their own perspective and their own passions and ambitions in life. And maybe your ambition was to be a nurse, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe you wanted to work in a factory, or maybe you wanted to work in a home. But you're right, that the choice should have been left up to the women to make that decision. And what happens after the war is a lot of men come back from the war and say, okay, I used to work in a factory. I want your job. Now you go back to working in the home. And that's just what we were deciding for you. And I think a lot of these women became really kind of upset and mad that they were being forced back into roles that they didn't necessarily want anymore, or didn't want to begin with. So the Civil War kind of inflames the movement, right? A lot of women after the Civil War become part of this women's rights movement. They've had a taste of what it's like to be free, and they want more of that. So what happens after the Civil War? Well, there's a period called Reconstruction in America. This is about a decade and a half after the Civil War, in which the nation's really trying to rebuild itself. And to rebuild itself, it's got to address some really serious issues. The first issue on the plate was ending slavery. In 1865, Congress passes the 13th Amendment that put an end to legal slavery in the United States. So now African Americans in this country would be set free. However, the 13th Amendment did not guarantee citizenship. And so the 14th Amendment comes along, and this amendment changes the Constitution to say that anybody naturalized that comes to this country and applies for citizenship can become a citizen regardless of their race or gender. But it does not, and it also says that people born in the United States are automatically considered citizens of the US. But it does not guarantee the right to vote. The 15th Amendment is actually a very important amendment because it guarantees the right to vote for all American men. So regardless of your background, your race, your religion, if you are born in America or you are a naturalized citizen and you're a man, you now have the right to vote. Now, you can imagine that African Americans in general were pretty pleased with this, right? Now, at least some African Americans have a voice when it comes to electing political leaders. And we know that following the 15th Amendment, a handful of African American men are actually elected to the House of Representatives, and one senator, an African-American man, is elected to the Senate. So this is very beneficial for the African-American community as a whole, but there were people in the women's rights movement that did not like the 15th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony actually said that she did not like the 15th Amendment because it still excluded women. So here's where we start to have a split in the women's rights movement. Many in the African American community, even suffragists in that community, supported the 15th Amendment because at least it guaranteed some sense of representation in their government, even if it wasn't women who were being given the right to vote. But as I mentioned, Susan B. Anthony herself was not very happy about that. She thought that the 15th Amendment should not be passed as it was because it did not correct the denial of voting rights based on gender. And so she argued that the 15th Amendment should not be passed. As you can imagine, this upsets many African Americans, and there's kind of a growing divide that's happening during this time. And Susan B. Anthony even goes as far as to kind of align with racists in the American South, going on to say, it's going on to make anti-African American arguments for women's suffrage, saying that perhaps white women should be given the right to vote and not African American women, and that white women could somehow counteract the vote of African American men with their votes. So this becomes a very controversial topic, this 15th Amendment, and it causes a major split in the party. And we're going to see that a lot of, I would say the wide majority of African American suffragists leave these organizations started by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and they go on to form their own organizations. We start to see the banding together of these multiple African American organizations later in the 19th century. So moving forward, we're going to have the National Women's Suffrage Association that is mostly white women, and we're going to have associations like the Association for Colored Women Voters, and that's going to kind of be there for African American suffragists. So they're fighting for the same thing, but there's this real divide in the movement. They're still fighting for the right to vote, though. So one person I want to look at in this movement, in the African American movement, is a woman named Ann Shadd Cary. Mary Ann is a pretty significant individual. She becomes a leader in the African American factions of the women's rights movement. And she was actually born in the early 1820s to parents that were part of the Underground Railroad. She was born into freedom, but as an African American family, her parents taught her about the struggles of African Americans enslaved in the Deep South. They participated in the Underground Railroad and helped many of these formerly enslaved folks escape to freedom. And they taught her about fighting for equality. And so when she grows up, she actually starts her own newspaper while she's living in Canada. It's an anti-slavery newspaper, but pretty soon she also starts voicing her opinion through her newspaper and also in person on rights for women. She says, "The crowning glory of American citizenship is that it may be shared equally by the people of every nationality, complexion, and sex." So Ann Shadd Cary is just one example of the many African American women fighting for the right to vote and equal rights across the board in the 19th century. So what about President Grant? He takes office in 1868, and he says in multiple speeches that he is going to fight for the civil rights of all Americans. And he's going to enforce civil rights, if need be, using the military. One example of this is when African Americans go to polling places in the 19th century and they try to exercise their right to vote. Many Southerners intimidated them with violence. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan start to spring up to keep these African American men from voting. Grant uses the military to enforce their rights. He sends military soldiers to polling places to make sure that these African American men would not be intimidated from exercising their right to vote. But what does Grant do to help the women's rights movement? The easy answer is not a lot. Grant does not have much to say openly about the women's rights movement. He doesn't campaign on the idea that women's rights is a big policy issue for him, but he does make some important steps forward as president. For instance, Grant appointed female postmasters. A postmaster is somebody who basically runs your local post office. And up until this point, women really hadn't held federal appointments before. So Grant does make a step in the right direction by appointing women to federal positions, federal appointed positions. He also goes on to sign a law protecting married women's property rights. A lot of husbands had debt in those days, and if your husband had debt, that might affect some property that you owned. And so Grant signs a law that kind of protects women's property from debt, from the debt of their husbands. And it also allowed for women to sue in court in Washington, D.C. So they now have more of a voice there in Washington. And one other thing he does, we talked about pay equality earlier. One thing that Grant does is he signs a law, a Senate bill that required all female clerks to be fully compensated and their salary equal to men in Washington, D.C. So federal female clerks are now going to make the same amount of money in their jobs as their male counterparts. So Grant doesn't do a lot to progress the movement. He's not outspoken about women's rights, especially the right to vote, but he does make some important steps in the right direction as president. And Susan B. Anthony and this woman, Virginia Louise Minor, actually both tried to vote for Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, there were over 15 people, 15 women who were arrested attempting to vote for Ulysses S. Grant in the election of 1872. So he does have women supporters for his presidency. Virginia Louisa Minor is kind of an interesting figure to us here in St. Louis because she lived in Missouri. She actually attempted to register to vote at the old courthouse in downtown St. Louis, and she didn't even make it to the polling place. She was arrested just for attempting to register to vote. She was really, as you can imagine, mad that she was arrested. She was upset by this. And she decides that she's going to found the Women's Suffrage Association of Missouri. So she's going to become one of the most prominent members of the women's rights movement here in Missouri. And like I say, she does try to register to vote for Ulysses S. Grant. I just want to take a moment as we kind of reach towards the end of our presentation to talk a little bit about why I call the presentation Daughters of Freedom, Rise of the Women's Rights Movement. This actually comes from a protest song, which was written in 1871. And this song was all about how women were trying to fight for their right to vote in the 19th century. So I want to take just 1 minute to play the song for you guys. The lyrics are up there on the screen. It's a pretty short song, but read along with the lyrics while you listen to this and think about what the meaning behind this song was. And hopefully in my last session, people couldn't hear it. Hopefully this time you all will be able to hear the song. Daughters of freedom, arise in your might. March to the watchman's justice and right. Why will ye slumber? Awake, awake. On your legions, Okay, so yeah, so Daughters of Freedom. It's a protest song. It's an anthem of the women's rights movement. They're going to sing these at sing this at their conventions. Women are going to buy the sheet music and play the song in their own homes. And ultimately, the lyrics kind of point out what they're talking about, right? They're talking about daughters of freedom. These are people involved in the movement, arising in your might, using your power to fight for justice and right. And it says in the very last line, come from the valley, hill, and glades. So they're calling people all around the country to action. Protest songs, something that kind of exists throughout American history and world history. People write songs about things they believe in, things they're fighting for. And I want to kind of extend this to your classrooms or to you students. You can actually write your own protest song. Come up with some lyrics about something you feel passionately about. Or if you're not a songwriter, maybe draw a poster or write a poem, because protest art is a great way to kind of spread your message and think deeply about the causes that you believe in. So this is just one example of a media that the women's rights movement is using to spread their message. I do want to mention, while we're talking about presidents and presidential elections, that in the election of 1872, there actually was a woman on the ballot. This woman was named Victoria Woodhull. She was 32 years old when she applied to be the presidential candidate for the Equal Rights Party. She chose as her running mate Frederick Douglass, who we already talked about. She believed that women should have the right to vote and even hold public office, obviously, since she wanted to be president. And she also believed that women should have more freedom in their marriages, that if they lived in a bad marriage, they should have the right to divorce that man and separate themselves from that bad situation, and that men and women in marriage should have equality. So she was very forward thinking for the time. I should mention that even though she chose Frederick Douglass as her running mate, Frederick Douglass actually did not consent to this. She chose him, but he even campaigned openly for her opponent, Ulysses S. Grant. So the Equal Rights Party, it didn't actually win any electoral votes in that election. We're not exactly sure how many popular votes she received, but we do know that 12 years later, another woman ran for president under the same party, the Equal Rights Party, and that woman received 4,149 votes from 6 states at that time. So there were women beginning to support the idea of a woman running for president. And of course, the first woman nominated by a major party would be Hillary Clinton in the election of 2016. Real quick story, Julia Dent Grant also has a role to play in the women's rights movement. During the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant's cabin that he built here in St. Louis was kind of put up for sale, and there was a dispute over who owned the cabin when it was put up for sale. Julia kind of fought for the rights to purchase that cabin, and the people that she was kind of buying it out from under argued that she shouldn't have the right to own that because women can't own property in Missouri. Ultimately, this case made its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of Missouri decided that, yes, women in Missouri do have the right to own property. This becomes kind of a landmark case. Julia herself was not openly in support of the women's rights, the women's right to vote, or the women's rights movement per se, but her role in this court case certainly advanced the rights of women in Missouri. Lastly, I want to look at kind of fast forwarding the timeline of when women finally get the right to vote and have a voice in American politics. So in 1890, women in Wyoming gained statehood, and women are given the right to vote. I actually just read about this during my lunch break, and I found out that the provisional governor of Wyoming, when he was seeking statehood, approached the federal government about the statehood, and the federal government basically told him, we are going to grant your statehood as long as you exclude women from having the right to vote. We don't like that policy. And he says, Wyoming will continue as a territory for another 120 years before it will exclude women's rights to vote. And so he made a point and kind of took a stand when they became a state that they would come in with women's right to vote. 3 years later, Colorado adopts the same thing. Women are given the right to vote. Fast forward almost 2 decades, Washington adopts that right. In 1910, Nevada and Montana. In 1917, as a result of all these newly enfranchised women, a woman herself is elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. She is the first female member of Congress, and the first thing she did was launch a bill to give all women the right to vote. It didn't make it very far, but it was the first steps in that fight on a national stage. 1918, Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma adopt women's suffrage. And finally, in 1920, nearly 100 years ago, the states ratified the 19th Amendment, granting all American women the right to vote. So this kind of gives us an idea of how long it takes for the nation to kind of, pick up the movement and really finally give women that right to vote and a voice in American politics. With that said, I know we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to get to some questions while I'm here. So what questions do you guys all have about the presentation today while we still have a little bit of time? And go ahead and raise your hand if you want to unmute, or you can type them in the chat.
Sure, it looks like Matthew, you have your hand raised. I'll go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Matthew. Matthew, if you're talking, we can't hear you. All right, it looks like Crystal has her hand up. So Crystal, I will go ahead and unmute you. Go ahead, Crystal.
You know how Susan B. Anthony was like one of the helpers? I found out that in my class we were taught about her, and we found out that there was a little girl that had the same name as her. They were both Susan B, and then one of them got arrested, but then the one that was gonna get arrested said, keep up the fight. We will win one day.
That's really cool. Yeah. So, Susan B. Anthony was the one who was arrested. And remember, she was arrested for trying to vote for Ulysses S. Grant. When she went to the polling place to try and vote, that's when she got arrested. But that's a really cool story. And it just kind of shows you how Susan B. Anthony, was motivating other people, even kids, right? Even a young girl with her own name to kind of join the fight and keep with it. That's what we call persistence or determination. And it was one of Ulysses S. Grant's best qualities, this determined attitude. And those involved with the women's rights movement, many of them never gave up on the movement. Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton, they never gained the right to vote during their lifetime. But it's not to say that their fight was in vain, because ultimately the work that they did kind of laid the foundation for the 19th Amendment to come. So that's a really great story. Thanks for sharing that. I think we got 1 minute left, so I can take a question or two here.
I don't think we have any other questions.
Okay, awesome. Well, perfect timing then. So I just want to, take a moment to say thank you all for attending today's presentation. I hope if you're ever in St. Louis, Missouri, that you stop by and see us here at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. Thank you to our host, the Presidents and Primary Sources Project and Internet 2. You all do wonderful work, and sign up for those future sessions if you haven't already. Again, thank you all for participating. You all had some really great questions and comments, and I really appreciate you all being here today. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, David, for sharing all your knowledge with us. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a great
Thanks.
afternoon. Bye.